products, what's happening in so many other places around the country. Cutbacks of support for universities and colleges have led to tuition soaring. The combination of soaring tuition and declining or stagnant incomes in the middle has meant the only way that you can get ahead is by borrowing. Student debt is now over $8 trillion, larger than credit card debt. It's affecting the way our economy functions in fundamental ways. Other countries have solved the problem in other ways. Australia has an income contingent loan program available for all the students, so they can borrow, but what they pay depends on their income. So if they decide to go into teaching high school, they know their income is going to be low, but the amount that they pay back adjusts commensurately. Whereas for so many young Americans, they feel their choices are constrained. They have to accept a job as a banker or a corporate lawyer when that's not really their passion, for good reason. And because it's the only way that they'll be able to pay back the crushing loans. The average student graduating from college now has $25,000 debt, but if you go on to graduate school, the numbers are more like $100,000, in some cases $200,000. Well, the final point I want to raise before I open it to question is that these problems that I've described won't be solved. There's no magic bullet. There's no, the problems have been growing for a third of a century. And so there's nothing that we can, there's no magic bullet, nothing we can do that will correct it right away. But if we don't begin, things will get worse and worse. We've seen the trajectory that our economy is on. An economy where we have growing and increasing inequality, where, for instance, 8 people who inherited their wealth have more wealth than the bottom 44% of the country, and exercise that wealth in the political sphere to try to make sure that they can, that others can't climb up. So it's really important for us now to recognize that minor tweaks in the system won't solve the problem. It is really important to increase the minimum wage. It is really important to increase educational opportunities. But unless we address some of the more fundamental structural problems that have led us to be the economy with the most inequality, we're just addressing the symptomatic problems. We aren't getting at the root causes. So that's why I think it's just imperative that we begin to discuss what are the root causes and figure out what to do about it. But I also think that we can't wait to solve the problem that, as I say, is going to take literally to correct the mistake that's been accumulating for a third of a century. It will take another 20, 30 years. In the meanwhile, I think we have to take actions to make sure that a middle-class lifestyle is accessible to the majority of our citizens. So I just want to end on this note of urgency. 35 years ago, we began this grand experiment, which anybody with an inkling of a scientific background would say has been a dismal failure. We have to change. And we can't go on as business as usual. I hope discussions like this, town hall meetings all over the country, will be part of a process of bringing about that kind of change, that we will take this course, not of accepting business as usual, continuing the course we've been on for a third of a century, but really going into the different course that will enable us to restore the kind of society that we had, the kind of social cohesion that we had in the decades after World War II. Thank you.
How important do you believe that unions are and continue to be towards maintaining the middle class. In this state, we have a very worrisome problem. There is a big movement to turn the state into a right-to-work state. What suggestions, what help do you think?
I think that would be a big mistake. And unions have played an important role in, as part of, you might say, our systems of checks and balances. One of the things I didn't have time to talk about was the issues of corporate governance and the power of executives. One of the really, truly outstanding facts of inequality in the United States is the growth of CEO pay relative to those of average citizens. Used to be 20 to 1, now it's closer to 301. And that increase is not because they suddenly got more productive. The bank CEOs got huge bonuses, not because, and even after 2008, when they brought the banks and our country to the brink of ruin, they walked off with huge bonuses. So what we have come to understand is that it's not just competitive forces in the way that you learned about that in your elementary textbooks that are driving the inequality in the United States, but it's you might say, a balance of power. And right now, we have an imbalance. And really, the voice of workers is not being adequately heard. And it's not heard in lots of different forms. I mean, for instance, one of the issues is the Federal Reserve. Monetary policy supposed to affect output, inflation, and unemployment. That's supposed to be the mandate to look after all three of those. But there's nobody representing workers. A lot of people representing the banks and the financial sector. And so you get an imbalance between a concern about inflation and a concern about unemployment. Some other countries that are much better performing have always a representative from workers on the Federal Reserve, on their equivalent of the central bank, the Federal Reserve Board. So unions are the way that workers get together in some sense and try to reflect the interests and concerns of workers. There are imperfections in unions, just like there are imperfections in corporations. I mean, no human institution is perfect. So, we know that there were lots of problems in the past. Unfortunately, the union's strength has been diminished to the point where it's about 10% of the labor force. Again, some people said that this is the natural evolution. It's not true. Other countries that have experienced just as much globalization, just as much technology, have a much greater voice of workers, and one of the reasons why they have more equality. So it's the way we shape our economy and our society.
There was a book that came out over a year ago by Thomas Piketty. One of the things he brought up was that from the progressive era until about 1980, that it was our economic results were mostly an anomaly, and that what we're doing is returning to what we naturally are when we were in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Yeah, so I actually did talk about that in my book very explicitly. A couple of the essays were, in some sense, written in response to Piketty. The title of his book is Capital in the 21st Century. And the main thesis is precisely what you said, that inequality is basically the natural workings of the capitalist system, and it's the accumulation of capital that's driving this inequality. And the real anomaly was what I call the golden age of capitalism of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I argue that he's wrong, that it's not about capital in the 21st century, it's about democracy in the 21st century. And that it's the way we shape the economic system, and that we can have a market economy, let me say a market economy, where markets actually work like markets are supposed to, where you have less market power on the part of monopolies, where you don't have the CEOs having the kind of say over the division of the corporate pie that they have, a whole set of of deviations from textbook economics that have driven inequality to the extent that it is. So my view is he's right in documenting the magnitude of inequality, but the interpretation of that, I think he's wrong. That I'm much more hopeful that we can do something about it if we can get our politics right.
A shift of power to capital took place, and that power was able to implement the policies that have produced the inequality, and we didn't have a successful Soviet Union to scare the capitalists as FDR did in the 30s. So isn't it really a lack of a viable socialist alternative that is the problem here?
Well, I think it is the framework that has been failed to be able to check the development of the power, you might say, of the 1%. And I use that as a metaphor because a lot of people in the 1% are actually worried about what has been happening to our society. And what I've been trying to describe is how changes in the rules and regulations have affected this change in the market power of monopoly, the weakening of unions. I tell in the beginning of my book an interesting story that reflects what happens when you don't have the check of real competition across economic systems. And I think that point that you make there is relevant. I was at a dinner party of somebody, in New York, we divided between the east side, west side, between east of Central Park and west of Central Park. And it's a little bit of a caricature, but it's still true that they're different cultures. And the east side, for those of you who don't know, is where the bankers live. And the west side is where the publishers and the musicians and Columbia University is. So, but I do get invited across the park occasionally, and I got invited across the park by somebody very wealthy who was very concerned about the growth of inequality, and she decided to have a dinner party and decided to invite a few academics and a number of billionaires, multi-billionaires. It was an interesting evening, marked by kinds of conversation that were really memorable. As one of the people who had inherited a few $1 billion was saying, how about lazy people, and then. And then he went on, people who shirked, and then he went on and talked about, with the guy sitting next to him, about where the best place to hide your money was the Cayman Islands better than some other offshore center. But then the conversation went on to a refrain that got heard several times in the evening, which was, remember the guillotine.